Many thanks. I'm one of those fossils that were referred to yesterday who still want to do evaluations, but quite frankly, I'm not going to. Okay, I admire most of you for being here anyway at this time of the day, after the party. The stories I've heard about it, you must be in good shape. Okay, now about the program today. You basically have most of the information, except you might want to know a little bit about the speakers. So let me do this one by one. Another apropos before we start, we plan to do it in this way, that the speaker will have about 20 minutes to present, and then we have a little discussion right after the presentation. We thought that this might be a better idea, otherwise the questions are forgotten in the meantime. So, this is the way we're going to go. Now, the first speakers don't need an awful lot of introduction, but I'll try anyway. It's a certain André Martinuzzi that most of you have heard this name, and Reinhard Steurer. They're both from the institute that is organizing the project and the conference. And André is heading this institute, and as you all know, he's the coordinator of the Easy Eco project. Reinhard is a senior researcher and lecturer at this university, and his specialty is governance and political science. Both of them, of course, have extensive experience in research, have done lots of evaluations and consulting in the areas of governance, corporate social responsibility, and sustainable development. Now, let me just read off to you again the presentation. The name of the presentation today is Knowledge-Based Governance for Sustainable Development, a typology of appraisals around the policy cycle. Please.
Good morning. Thank you very much, André, for your nice introduction. I'm glad you could make it after the party. I already thought about we should reschedule it next time to 4 to 8, but the crowd is big enough, so we can leave it the way it was, I think. As you mentioned, the title of our presentation is Knowledge-Based Governance, and a brief note on the title. Knowledge-based seems to be a popular phrase. We all know the Lisbon strategy is referring to a knowledge-based economy. We all know the phrase of knowledge-based societies or information societies. Now, in such a surrounding where everything should be knowledge-based, it's clear that policy making and governance should be knowledge-based as well, at least to some extent. What we understand under knowledge-based governance is decision-making in the public sphere that builds on evidence produced by different forms of appraisals. And by using the word appraisal rather than evaluation, you see that we extend the focus a little bit from the narrow type of evaluations to other forms of knowledge. What we paint is a kind of ideal type picture, of course, selective ideal type, how governance could or should be knowledge-based. And of course the reality is often not that close to an ideal type picture, and in the next presentation from Reinhard we will hear how reality looks like. But let's first focus on how governance could be knowledge-based. Let's give you an orientation of the structure of our presentation first. First, we will talk about the roles different forms of appraisals can play in the context of governance. André will do that part. Afterwards, we will introduce you to basic ideas, principles, and steps of governance for sustainable development. And we will present you a cyclical model. Based on that, we will kind of group different types of appraisals around that cyclical model. And at the end, we draw some conclusions on the interplay of governance and appraisals or policy-relevant knowledge that is generated around the governance cycle. Before we go into the first point, let me briefly give you some thoughts that we had standing behind this presentation, some deliberations we had in developing it. First of all, we wanted to revisit the themes we mentioned in the call. You know, you issue a call, you have a pretty coherent picture of what the conference will be about. Then the call gets torn apart by all different papers, contributions, which is a good thing because the issues we raise in the call get enriched with further aspects. It gets different things get different emphasis from your contributions. So overall, the picture is there, but it gets shaped in different ways and it gets enriched. Halfway through this event, I guess you've seen many pieces of that picture, of that mosaic or puzzle, and it may be difficult to see the forest because of all the trees standing around. So we thought it's a good idea to raise awareness for the forest of knowledge-based governance again and try to put the different pieces together. The second purpose of the presentation is that we thought it is good to complement the picture that is drawn by other keynote speakers, and we want to do that in three different respects. First of all, as you know, the conference title is Governance by Evaluation. Now, so far in the plenary session, we didn't hear that much about governance in the context of sustainable development, so we want to introduce some key aspects and emphasize what we understand about it. Second, as I mentioned, we want to broaden the focus a little bit from classical types of evaluation to all different kinds of appraisals. And third, we want to contextualize different forms of appraisals, not only in terms of who uses them, but also in terms of where are they produced, at which stage in the policy cycle. Now let's get started with the first point on knowledge-based governance and the roles of appraisals.
When you talked about the evaluations, it was fun for me to think that here as an economist and a political scientist talking about woods and trees. So it shows a little bit how we see the disciplinarity, and it is funny to see that there are different approaches to typologies as well. So in some sciences, typologies are drawn up by clear criteria in the very beginning, typically natural science. So coming from this system of animals and plants, and we want to know which animal is this, and if it has 4 legs, then it's clear. If it has only 2 legs, that's something different, and it's a clear set of criteria. And in social sciences, you approach reality, you collect things that you can find in reality, and then you find similarities. So it's a little bit similar. If you try to explain this to natural scientists, normally they ask for the clear criteria, and in the very beginning you don't have these clear criteria, you just observe what is in reality. And this is also the approach I took when I came across this evaluating sustainable development field several years ago. It was in the late 1990s, where we just collected evaluation reports. And we found it rather interesting to see what can be called evaluation reports. Because sometimes you find a report claiming to be an evaluation report, and you really lack a lot of things, you miss a lot of things in these reports. On the other hand, you find records that don't claim to be evaluation reports, but clearly they are. So we just try to put them into different boxes, typology, and then we got the impression that there are different routes of evaluating sustainable development in different cultures and different purposes. So trying to bring this in a broader picture, a little bit in connection with what Mike Patton yesterday told us. There are some similarities. We see that different political roles, policy appraisals, or evaluations, or assessments, or a lot of words. And I found it rather difficult that in different cultures, evaluation, assessment, appraisal is used in a slightly different way. So we decided we will talk about appraisals, but as there's a kind of joke wording, governance by evaluation, I stick to this evaluation now for one moment. But take it in some way, appraisal, assessment, evaluation, different cultures, different words, same things. So there is one route of evaluation which comes from being accountable for something and the need to legitimize something. So whenever there are measures with great effects or even high financial input, at the very end there's a call for the evaluator. There's a simple principle among the evaluators: community follow the money. Not just when you're evaluating something, also when you're looking for jobs as evaluators, just follow the money, you will find the evaluation. So the purpose is accountability. The type of evaluation is mostly ex post, and as you try to legitimize something, you need most of the times indicators. These are typical value for money studies. So you have an input, financial input into a program or whatever, and at the very end you have outputs, and then you calculate tons CO2 emission reduction and the costs per ton CO2 emission reduction, so euro per ton, and then you compare different things, for example. Typical indicator-oriented value for money studies. The role of the evaluator is typically the role of the expert. So he is the expert in the field of whatever it might be, agriculture, cleaner production technologies, and so on. And the fields of applications are in Europe, mainly structural funds, subsidy programs, wherever there's a lot of money. Another route of evaluation, and another route of appraisals is evaluation is conflict moderation. This is another purpose we saw back in Austria, for example, back in the 1970s. We had a lot of societal conflicts about atomic power plants. Later on, also about water power plants. And in these cases, there was a seek for a consensus in situations with a high potential for societal conflicts. Typically, the environmental impact assessment came up with, to deal with these problems. And these types of evaluations, they are mostly ex ante. They apply participatory methods, and they focus on the quality of the process, as the role of the evaluator is a kind of neutral moderator. Surely you have some experts within these impact assessments, for example, but the evaluator who conducts the whole procedure, who leads the whole procedure, his main qualification is that he's neutral towards the project. Typical fields of applications: technology assessment, environmental impact assessment, extended impact assessment, sustainability impact assessment. So again, you see a lot of different words on different levels. And there's a third origin of evaluation that I think is the most interesting one at the moment, and the one that you don't find a lot of literature about it by now, but it's increasing number of publications on evaluation as a policy learning device. There we see that evaluation is applied when something is very innovative, for example, very innovative programs, program design, and program managers calling for quick feedback, being interested in the learning cycle, being interested in learning about what can be improved in the program design or the program implementation. Most of these evaluations are accompanying organization evaluations, and they apply organizational development methods. So the role of the evaluator comes close to a consultant for the people who are responsible for the program implementation. Typical fields of applications are theory-based evaluations. If you put this together, you can say in the beginning you have appraisals as conflict moderation when a program or a project comes up. You have appraisals as policy learning devices in an accompanying way, and at the very end appraisal as legitimization. Now together we could call this governance by evaluation, this was the idea why we have this governance by evaluation as a title for the whole conference.
Now let's bring governance into the game. As I said, so far we haven't heard that much about governance for sustainable development. And this is a field where we have worked a lot in recent years, and our expertise is in particular on sustainable development strategies. So what I would paint is a picture of a cyclical model of governance that is closely related to sustainable development strategies and how they work. And in the next step, I will try to group different forms of appraisals around that cycle, just to highlight the link between governance and appraisals. Key features of contemporary governance for sustainable development are sustainable development strategies, as I mentioned, due to the lack of other more powerful instruments. That is, at the moment, the most comprehensive instrument that is supposed to orchestrate different other instruments. They resemble most often strategic processes more than documents. That is progress compared to former environmental plans, which were only documents without follow-up, without monitoring, and so on. They aim at normative principles of sustainable development, and I will mention them in a few seconds, by following some key process steps, and I will run through those steps also in a minute, which form a cycle. And let's have a look at the cycle right now. These are the principles that stand at the center of sustainable development governance, and I don't have to explain them to you because I'm sure you're all aware of what they're about. The first step at the beginning of the cycle is, of course, political commitment and guidance. There is little sense in every political action if there is no political commitment at the beginning, and if there is no guidance on how policy should be developed or how a strategy should look like. At that stage, the key points of the agenda should be set, and a mandate should be given to others like public administrators, later responsible for the process. The second step is, of course, to specify goals, formulate a broad long-term vision, but also SMART objectives. And SMART stands for specific, measurable, adequate, realistic, and timed. In particular for evaluators, these criteria are quite important because you all know that it's difficult to evaluate a program if the objectives are fuzzy and unclear at the beginning. And of course, the goals that need to be specified at this step also should address the governance principle at the center. They should say how, for example, policy integration should be addressed or implemented, and so on. So with this step, we go from a broad political will to goals that kind of direct the rest of the process. The third step is, of course, as in the conventional policy cycle, to design policies that are able to meet the goals and objectives. Now, first, of course, you need to explore different policy options. Second, you have to take a decision for one of the policy options, formulate a policy or design the policy, and most importantly, secure the budgets to really implement that policy. And this step brings us from goals to policy options and policies. The fourth step, again, closely related to the conventional policy cycle that is quite popular in political science, is to implement those policies that were designed in the third step. They need to be adopted, they need to be enforced, and that brings us from options to actions. And fifth, that opens the cycle to a new round. There should be a renewal of political commitment and a renewal of guidance, so that the cycle can start over again, and that brings us from actions to renewal, to new goals, and so on. Of course, this step should be mainly based, in our ideal type picture, should be mainly based on knowledge, on evidence, on different forms of appraisals. Now, let's move exactly into that direction. Let's see how the different forms of appraisals we address in this conference are circled around this cycle. First, let's start with the most obvious. We have ex ante and ex post appraisals. You're all familiar with those types. There are many different forms. Second, there's something closer to the policy cycle, and that is about sustainable development monitoring with indicators. That is most often carried out by public administrators themselves, and also rather close to the policy strategy cycle are peer reviews, also carried out by public administrators themselves. They try to learn from each other. They, as scientists get reviewed by scientists, they get reviewed by colleagues from other countries. Apart from that, a little bit further outside, we have applied research and studies, and I think we all know very powerful examples of this type of appraisal. The Steurer report, for example, the IPCC reports are all fall into that category, and they all have pretty strong influence, not necessarily on policy instruments, but on the agenda setting in the first stage. And rather far outside, we have still basic research, which is supposed to develop methods, ask very fundamental questions, and it's rather unlikely, or the chance is not so big, that basic research reaches into the core of policy making, but it sure influences the different types of appraisals that I've mentioned. Oh, this is still my slide. And I have to run through it rather quickly because we only have 3 minutes left. Basic conclusions out of this grouping. First of all, there is something like knowledge-based governance. At least the policy-making cycle is surrounded by different types of appraisals, and if you look at the big picture, there is a stream of information that surrounds policy making. So it's more a stream of information than single studies. Of course, it depends on the perspective you take. Second, and that is an important point we want to stress, there's also governance-based knowledge generation. All the different types of appraisals that group around the policy cycle are, of course, influenced by the place where they take place. And it should be like that, because that's the only way to tailor-make them, to make them heard by policymakers and administrators. If knowledge generation were not based on governance, it would be far remote from what decision makers need. And third, this point relates to what we've heard from Michael Patton yesterday, that knowledge that is produced around that strategy cycle is not always tailor-made, it's not always demanded, it's not always heard and or understood because of different reasons. And two of them are different languages and logics are used in different communities and different forms of appraisals. And there's a strong self-reference in each community, in each expert community, and that's exactly what André will talk about.
To end our presentation, to be a little bit provocative and to stimulate the discussion, I would like to add two very personal thoughts. This is not results of basic research, this is just an observation. I got the impression that there's a kind of management perspective on evaluation which is a little bit technocratic, which is a little bit in a mechanistic paradigm, saying there's basic research hands over results to applied research hands over knowledge to evaluations and consulting, and evaluations and consulting, they consult policymakers and administration and hope that all of this will be kept in mind when policy is designed and implemented. On the other hand, research agendas are defined by public discourse. They are contracted out, for example, in calls, in tenders, by funding decisions, in the other way around. So on one side you have governance is shaped by research methods. On the other hand, research agenda is defined by public discourse and funding decisions. So when we have this in mind, then there seems to be an area of potentially knowledge-based governance, but is there also an area of policy-irrelevant research? And is there, on the other hand, a research-free policy making? This kind of picture, this kind of idea of handing over results from basic research to applied research and so on, well, something will get lost on the way, and something will be added on the way. So in my mind, the question is, how big is this area of potentially knowledge-based governance? The second provocative thought is, well, we built it up on a book based on Niklas Luhmann's systems, social systems theory. And when we see science, evaluation, and administration and policy as different systems, then there might be self-referential. So they might be configured around the individual code. There might be some explicit and implicit system functions. For example, power, success, depending on these system functions. And there might be a very limited chance of transfer of knowledge, because self-perception of autopoietically closed systems is typically for a system's perspective. So perhaps there's no handing over of results. Perhaps these systems are just monitoring and perceiving and attending what they are doing themselves. So this is just a provocative idea, and to end up, this is just the last advertisement.
Yeah, and we plan to summarize our presentation in the introductory chapter of the upcoming book that will be done on this conference, and we will of course also try to pick the most relevant papers that address the conference topic in that book. So we might cross ways in the next few months in putting that book together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. The floor is all yours, please. Are there any questions, comments?
Thank you. Very interesting and very provocative. I'm interested in the diagram you showed with the concentric circles going out. I'm sitting here thinking, how do you conceptualize the connection between governance, the policy cycle, And the reality that policy changes are often brought about as a result of pressure from civil society, the whole feedback from society for change. Those that aren't in control of the agenda. Most of the people that you're speaking of here are in control of either bringing about policy or setting governance. But the society around and the innovations around citizen scorecards and the pushback for more accountable delivery of better services to people. How do you bring this into your configuration?
Thank you.
That's a very good point, and it would also fit into knowledge-based governance as a broad concept. It would not fit into the notion of appraisals, because what for example, stakeholder bodies like national commissions or councils for sustainable development do is they, on the one hand, they sometimes provide appraisals and studies. On the other hand, they also provide knowledge by simply bringing stakeholder opinions to the government. So certainly it fits into the picture of governance-based knowledge, but not necessarily into the picture of appraisals. Where to put it in this cyclical model is a difficult question. And it would be somewhere probably outside of the appraisal or research community, because it's a different societal sector that is addressed, or different groups of stakeholders that is addressed. But it's certainly relevant, and in particular in the context of sustainable development.
Okay? Yes, please.
In my experience, the sequential numbering you have is how things actually happen. But one of the issues which we started to discuss yesterday was that goals and objectives are not always smart. And I think this is because, in fact, you need to combine the goal setting and the design of policies. If you have goal setting before you design policies, you really may face some difficult problems, because the whole design of the policies will determine what goals are possible. But this does seem to be how it actually works. And when we're designing indicators, it does present us with a lot of difficulties. Sometimes the goals are not achievable.
This is exactly what Michael Patton mentioned yesterday when he spoke of Mintzberg's theory of strategic management. On the one hand, we have that intended strategy. Those are the goals that are developed in step 2. But on the other hand, we all know that other goals come up in the course of the process. So we always have a kind of emergent strategy that builds the fulfilled strategy at the end, together with a part of the goals defined at the beginning. So absolutely, I don't even think that reality is so close to this ideal type model. I think reality resembles more that emerging type of strategy, but of course it follows this cycle, and it sometimes steps out of the cycle. So again, this is a simplified ideal type picture. Many strategy processes follow it partly, but then still have to deal with the fact that strategies are emerging. And yeah, it's I think a good thing that these things are in motion, that they develop and they're emerging. And Mans mentioned yesterday that we seem to face similar developments in other political fields or in theories, like the governance concept is more open than the government concept, and so on. So everything is in flux.
Okay, let me just, because I don't see a handout right now, present a bit of a dinosaur view of this also, which, once upon a time I've been trained as an economist. And one of the things that you learn in household theory is that people maybe don't look at their utilities first, priorities, but they look at what they can afford. They look at the budget constraint, and constraint is the important word. That's exactly my interpretation in terms of economic theory. Namely, whenever you consider doing something, you have to look at the goals and the constraints at the same time. Now, they're not always financial constraints, like the economists would have it in the model. But I think this idea of constraints is important. And it's interesting that in the public realm, because I think you picture it the way it's really happening. That people first look at what they can sell politically, and then you secure the budget. Now, obviously, it's not always the way it's working. Okay, but I saw a hand up. Yes. Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Thank you. Sophie Purdy from the Environment Agency in the UK. Could we just move to the final slide that you had, which was quite interesting to me? Yeah, that one with all the arrows and things. I covered this from I suppose the sort of the irrational political side of things. You know, I'm a policy maker. The research-free policy making. The concern I have with all of this is that it is supposing a deeply rational approach to this. That's not my experience. So, I'm sorry, but it's true. What advice do you have for someone like me, who lives in the world of research-free policy making, to try and improve this side?
Well, I thought this is a kind of technocratic way of seeing things, and a kind of mechanistic way of seeing things. And I think this is the way as typical mechanistic paradigm allocated scientists want to see how they could affect policy. So I don't see that this is the way. This is one paradigm. And in this paradigm, it is rather frustrating for scientists to see what a lot of research is completely ignored by policy. And there's a lot of discussion about which indicators could be policy relevant or could be designed in a way that policy could use them. And I think this is a long tradition in sustainable development to discuss about indicators without having any goals. So to me, as coming from management side, it's rather funny to see how people are discussing indicators without having goals. It is similar as we would discuss an indicator for being in Salzburg without going to Salzburg, or even without having decided that we could go to Salzburg. So perhaps to having a mountain as the indicator, or we are in Salzburg, we should think about Lake Balaton in Hungary. This could be an indicator as well. And as long as we don't know where we are going, I think the whole debate about indicators is a little bit irrelevant. So to my mind, the question is not only which indicators can be designed for policy, but is there a kind of evidence-based policy behind it? And there I see big differences between European cultures. Even as you come from the UK, I think evidence-based policy making is something that you're familiar with, much more familiar than we are in Austria, and even much more familiar as more Eastern Europe you go. So we don't have such a culture of evidence-based policy. So perhaps the main shift is not in designing indicators, but designing the way as policy legitimizes itself. Not as the leader who decides everything, but as a kind of more technocratic or fact and evidence-based management of societies. But this is a management man's point of view. You might have different points of political science.
Not know if possible. Please add one more.
I'll be very quick because my question was very similar to the last question. I think this is a very interesting paradigm you described it of how policy on sustainable development might be formulated based on the evidence. But clearly there are other competing paradigms as to how decisions are made on sustainable development. So I think what would be a very interesting research agenda would be to look at this hypothesis or paradigm compared to some of the other paradigms which hypothesize how decisions are made on sustainable development and see to what extent the evidence-based hypothesis holds up against other politics-based hypotheses.
Well, I see this analogy because this book I just quoted here, Strategy Industry, Systems Theoretic Analysis of the Interface